Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he'll be waiting in Turkey to conduct peace talks with Vladimir Putin. This comes after the Russian president proposed direct negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul this Thursday. Zelenskyy has called on Russia to implement a full ceasefire on Monday before any negotiations begin. He says Ukraine is still waiting for a response from Moscow to its truce proposal.
Vladimir Putin blamed Ukraine for interrupting previous talks in Istanbul that ended abruptly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Putin told reporters in the Kremlin that Russia is now ready to reopen negotiations.
We want serious talks with Ukraine. The goal is to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and to reach an enduring and long-lasting peace.
But Putin's words were met with derision by Ukrainians on the streets of Kyiv.
Putin is a coward. He's afraid. Everything he does is to save himself. Why should we trust him now?
Putin is trying to buy time. It is just empty talk of no consequence.
He just needs a tactical pause, but obviously we could use it as well.
And talk of ceasefires brings little respite for Ukrainian troops on the front line, where there's been no let-up in fighting apart from a lull over Easter and a shaky three-day pause last week.
There is no truce. Our comrades are dying. We left our families behind, our homes, our sisters, for whom we must fight. And as long as our hearts are beating, we will move forward, with God on our side.
We are constantly deceived by so-called truces and ceasefires, while they are pulling in their ammunition and their people. They are constantly deceiving us.
As besieged civilians clear the debris of renewed Russian shelling, they can only hope that the ceasefire talks proposed in Istanbul this coming week will bring a long-awaited breakthrough.
Donald Trump had earlier urged Zelenskyy to accept Putin's proposal for ceasefire talks in Istanbul. Writing on his Truth social platform, Trump said Ukraine's leader should immediately agree to meet the Russian president. Trump said Ukraine would at least be able to determine whether a deal was possible, though he was beginning to doubt whether Kyiv would reach an agreement with Vladimir Putin. Well, let's go to Kyiv now and speak to DW's Rebecca Ritters. Rebecca, great to see you. So Zelenskyy says he'll be waiting for Putin in Turkey, but at the same time, the Ukrainian president wants a ceasefire first, right?
Hi, Pablo. Yeah, well, listen, we seem to be in another round of tweet diplomacy here. I mean, whether or not Zelenskyy is really shying away from his earlier claims that he's wanting a ceasefire remains to be seen. I mean, if you look at the language of the tweet that he sent out, he certainly says he's still hoping for a ceasefire. So it's not entirely clear whether he means that he will go on Thursday, even if there is no ceasefire. That's certainly a backtrack from what was agreed to and announced on Saturday when EU leaders came to Kyiv. So, it's not sure whether this is a huge shift in Zelenskyy's position, but what it does seem to be is perhaps trying to bat the ball back into Putin's court, to sort of up the ante, if you will. If the two leaders do meet, or if Zelenskyy goes there on Thursday, this is going to be, a huge momentous occasion in the 4 years of this war. The two leaders have not met directly. They've not spoken since the breakout of the war. And Moscow and Kyiv haven't spoken since the very, very early days of the war in March 2022. So obviously this is going to be a momentous occasion. We'll just have to see whether or not Putin comes to the table. I think it's unlikely that we'll see Putin himself come to Turkey. But I think what we're seeing here with Zelenskyy's tweet is him trying to bat the pressure back into Putin's corner.
All right. Is Zelenskyy then playing to a single member as well in the crowd too, though, perhaps? Donald Trump, of course.
Well, I think we probably have to be a little bit cynical there and say yes to that question, Pablo. I think, considering the timing, considering this tweet came out just shortly after Donald Trump, sort of changed his tune and kind of sidelined the Europeans with his tweet demanding that Zelenskyy go ahead and go to these talks with or without a ceasefire. That's certainly, as I said, different to what was being said and what was agreed to on Saturday, supposedly also agreed to by President Trump. So that is a shift in his terminology. So I think we can say that, yeah, this tweet from Zelensky most likely is trying to show Trump that he is, in fact, definitely being the grown-up here, that he's willing to go ahead with these talks and, as I said, trying to bat that back into Putin's corner, trying to perhaps, put him on the spot and let him be the one that looks like he's not coming to the party if he doesn't agree to come on Thursday. So, yeah, I would say that he probably, this tweet is directly aimed at one person, and that is Donald Trump.
Tell us about the expectations there in Kyiv that a ceasefire could actually start tomorrow on Monday.
I mean, you heard some of the voices from the streets of Kyiv there in that report. I think people are pretty skeptical, and that's certainly from everyone I've spoken to. On Saturday, you walk around, you talk to people, and people kind of roll their eyes. They say, Putin can't be trusted. Why should we trust him now? I think the expectation that a ceasefire will go ahead is very, very low. We just heard for the first time in a few days the sirens just about, a little while ago. So, ceasefire certainly not happening at the moment, and I don't think we're likely to see anything tomorrow. Of course, who knows? We don't know anything until it happens. We really have to wait and see what happens tomorrow. But I think, Putin himself has said that he doesn't agree to a ceasefire. The Russians are definitely pretty strong on their word there. I think, it certainly doesn't look like it's going to happen at this stage. And I don't think anybody in Ukraine believes it will.
All right, we'll leave it there, Rebecca. Great to have your insights there. DW's Rebecca Ritters reporting from Kyiv. Thanks. Earlier, we spoke to Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert before Zelensky announced he was ready to meet Putin for direct talks. I asked him whether he thought Russia would agree to a 30-day ceasefire.
No, I don't think so, because that will look, for Putin, it will look like weakness. And Putin is someone who's terribly afraid always of looking weak. And in his view, announcing a ceasefire, essentially like 1 day, a day and a half, after the Europeans, the so-called coalition of the willing, demanded it, will be showing weakness. So no, I don't think it's going to happen. And this is something that it's very difficult to imagine for me.
Now, European allies have threatened massive new sanctions if Putin doesn't agree to the ceasefire, though. So would that not be enough for him to perhaps change his mind?
Well, we go back again to this idea that if they threaten sanctions and Putin says, OK, now I'm going to go for a ceasefire, that's also a sign of weakness. Moreover, I think what is interesting is that we had President Trump announcing on his social media, through social, that he wants Zelensky to talk to Putin on Thursday. So it'll be very difficult for Ukraine not to agree to do that. But it's interesting that Trump made it pretty conditional. It's not just this traditional thing, trust Putin, everything's going to be all right. He said, if Zelensky agrees, we'll see if Putin is serious. And after that, everyone, including European allies, can draw the conclusion. So I think that's an incentive for Zelensky, at least to think about talking to Putin. And it's interesting also that President Erdogan, who agreed to host the talks, also demanded a ceasefire. So for Putin, it will also be very, very difficult to come to the table, if he does, without some kind of promise of stopping the fighting, at least temporarily.
Konstantin, let's talk a little bit more about President Trump, because, of course, the European allies brought him back on board again, we'll say. How important is it for Russia to keep Trump involved, though?
I think it is important, Pablo, because once Trump, for example, says, no, I'm not interested anymore, Putin lost my trust, then essentially you have in a different form than it used to be, let's say, under Biden, essentially a complete Western coalition that doesn't trust Putin. And Putin doesn't want it. So I think that driving a wedge, playing on the quote-unquote good Trump intentions versus bad European threats is something that he, I think, intends to do. But how long it could play out, that's a different question. I don't think it could play out too long. We have seen signs that in Washington they are losing patience with Putin, and probably that may be irreversible if Putin lies again.
Always great to get your analysis, Konstantin. DW Russia analyst Konstantin Eggert, thank you.